Good morning, everybody, or I should say good afternoon. Bryan Adler with the Rothkopf Law Group. I'm joined here by John Freitag of All American Hospice and Brenna Galvin, a Minneapolis-based elder law attorney and also a death doula. Many of you are familiar with Rothkopf Law Group. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with John Freitag and his now viral interviews he's been doing with long-term care professionals. And out of interest from John and also my relationship with Brenna, whom I've known for the better part of a decade, I thought it was a natural connection to introduce John, who's in hospice with a death doula, and learn a little bit more about it. So I'll be here in the background. I might throw a question in or two, but generally this is yours, John. Take it away. John and Brenna, take a moment to introduce yourselves and then have at it.
I'll start. My name is John Freitag. I've worked with All American Hospice. Thank you again, Bryan, for including me in this. And Brenna, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you both for asking me to be on. I'm Brenna Galvin. I am a shareholder at Mazer, Amundsen and Boggio in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The accent will come out today for all of your the people tuning in. I am an elder law attorney by kind of training, and in that experience I began witnessing a gap where we've worked really hard in our practice. My practice is very similar to the Rothkopf Law Group, where we have social workers and great ties with the caregiving community. We provide a holistic service, but I was noticing that I was receiving a lot of calls from my clients and their loved ones in the final days of their life. And usually the calls were fairly frantic. There was a lot of anxiety about an upcoming death, and they didn't know what to do and where to put their energy. And so from those calls, I decided that there had to be something more. It felt a little bit like, well, you have your financial affairs in order and your legal affairs in order. Now just take care of one another. It didn't feel like quite enough.
There's a big gap there.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so much of what I witnessed is, even with excellent hospice providers and teams around individuals at end of life, there is still a lot of time where the person dying is alone with their loved ones and their families, and often not knowing what's happening, why it's happening, or what to do. And so that's looking at that issue or that gap in service. I started doing a little research and listened to podcasts and interviews and found that there's this world of end-of-life doulas who serve as a guide for people at end of life. And I was like, this mixes all of my passions. How do we really care for people going through this major life transition?
That's great, because I think being in hospice, I've been in hospice for about 4 years now, and I noticed a lot of the same things. So there is so much unknown, and people are really scared to even broach the subject. And then when it comes, even if it's not it seems like it's always an emergency, even though there was a disease process leading up to it. But all of a sudden it catches everyone off guard, and now they're scrambling to make these decisions. And when it's an emergency, they're not going to be able to make the best decisions. So that's good that you're able to sort of lead them into it, working with them early on as their elder law attorney, and just to explain to them, what the steps are.
So, John, you touched on something interesting, that it's, hospice is almost always an emergency. When are you getting involved, Brenna? When does a death doula, when do you recommend a death doula be brought into the game?
Yeah, so ideally, the goal is culturally that we begin having conversations earlier in our life cycles to really plan for this major life event, just like we do births, marriages, retirement, and start talking about dying process in our lives, and make sure that that demystifies death a little bit when we have those conversations sooner. But in general, the end of life doula typically gets called upon when there is a diagnosis of a terminal condition, similar to the calls or the recommendations or referrals to hospice care agencies. Ideally, we like to work with families earlier in the process, where we can sit down and do kind of the first stage of planning. And for end-of-life doulas, that stage is really kind of summing up and planning. So we explore what life meaning looks like to the person, their values, we get to know them a little bit and their family members, and we start planning for what their vigil would look like. So their final few days of life, few weeks of life. And then we have that information that guides us to going into those final days. However, often families don't know to call soon enough, right? They think I think you said that well, John, where you said death is almost always a surprise, even with the diagnosis. I think that I've worked with many families whose loved ones has been in hospice for a number of months and are still shocked when they actually die. We're just, we can't quite wrap our heads around that, the magnitude of that loss. So I think that the death doula's work is really powerful when we get to talk to them and get to know them and make sure their plan is reflective of who they are and what they're all about. But if people need us at the last minute just to serve as a companion, a guide, a advocate, you know, for their wishes in those final days, that's what we can do. We work with people who don't always have the capacity to express their planning wishes. So sometimes we're taking cues from family and other support systems about what their wishes are and how to make sure supported.
That's a good point with the wishes, though, because I know there was an initiative locally in Bucks County where they were trying to push people to do their living wills, you know, sooner than later, because, you know, as I don't know, the listeners, living wills are for someone to express their wishes, CPR, you know, resuscitation, intubation, all that stuff, while you still have the capacity to do so. So the idea is you can do it early on, and then when you get to a point where you need it, your family's not scrambling to make the decision. So, you know, I sat through the course and I did one for myself, which was really uncomfortable, you know. So I understand why people don't want to do it. How early are you involved in any initiatives to try to push that earlier than later? Or are you seeing a lot of people just waiting till it's too late? What are you seeing?
So in my elder law practice, when we're doing estate planning with clients, we're trying to get them, and we're making sure that a healthcare directive or living will is part of their overall estate plan. What I would say is typically when an attorney looks at a living will or a healthcare directive, or even a medical professional is looking at it, we come at it with different lenses. You know, we're like, legally, there needs to be an agent appointed. All the rest, you know, from a legal perspective is not needed. It helps inform the agent, but it's not necessary per se. But from an end-of-life doula perspective, I'd say that the planning is far more holistic than that. It's really talking about, in light of a diagnosis or a change in health status, what do we want how do we plan an environment that honors your life and honors how you want to die? And that is really hard to do prospectively. Some people know and can say, you know, they want to die at home. And then we start talking about, okay, well, if we do that and we need a hospital bed to come into your house, where do you want that to be? How can we function in that space? Is there ways to make it livable for you, functional for you and your loved ones, and still honor your wishes? And so some of it's tactile planning like that.
And sometimes they get very specific. Like, I mean, if you look at it, it's hard because you could be broad and say, I just want to have a quality of life. I'll stay on mechanical ventilation or something if I can have some sort of quality of life. But that's what I might perceive as a quality of life is going to be totally different than what maybe Bryan perceives or you.
Right.
So you really need to be able to spell it out and say, you know, is it communicating with your children? Is it being able to, you know, ride a motorcycle? Is it, you know, so it's going to be a huge range, right?
That's an interesting point that you bring up, because I think that or I'm going to say my guess is, Brenna, that the death doula training changed your perspective. You've already said it changed your perspective, but I know that I have to sometimes stop myself because I know what my end of life wishes are now as a dad with young kids. I know what it is, but that might change over time. Regardless, though, when you have that conversation with families or clients or patients, depending on your role, you have to be careful not to project that. You know, when I have that discussion, I don't want to say, do you want to be let to die peacefully and inexpensively by having all extreme measures withdrawn, or linger for months at the expense of your insurance and your family and the suffering? Like, you have to be as objective as possible. And that can be difficult based on your own personal beliefs, your own personal perspective. But Brenna, you kind of are coming at it from both directions now, both the clinical healthcare aspect and the legal aspect.
Well, I think that you touch on something really important as professionals and providers, that we have to leave room to actively listen to our clients and patients, residents. We have to make sure that they have the opportunity to process the information. So when we start this work of life meaning, summing up, making vigil plans, this is often not something that we can knock out, in an hour and a half conversation. This is something that people need to be introduced to, a way of thinking, a way of living that's different, and really allow themselves time to reflect on that and have conversations, and make sure that we as professionals can help guide, introduce topics that are important to doing that, but not put our own values on them. I think that what's interesting that I hear a lot from clients is, I don't want any heroic measures taken, or I want to have quality of life, but the examination often stops there. And, we need to challenge one another and our clients and professionals to say, what does that mean? What does a good day look like to you? What do you want to be able to do with your loved ones? Or how do you want to be able to communicate with them? How do you want to be in commune with them? Are there people you do not want to be in commune with in the last of your life?
For some people, that list might be longer than the ones that they want around.
Right. So I think that when we look at this from our planning as lawyers, Bryan and I, when we're doing this work, it's different when we're starting to talk through to clients at end of life. What does this actually look like? We don't often talk about what happens to your body when you die. Our bodies know how to die, right? There are traits or similarities that happen in the dying process across the board. And so I think it's really important that as professionals who understand that, we can educate and train. And when people have information, they tend to be able to make better decisions. They tend to be a little less anxious because there's less unknown. So I think that's really important for all of us as we look at this process.
Yeah. So as a death doula, or when you're trained, do you learn about each disease that you're going to maybe come across, or is it something that you're picking up as you're going? Because I know one of the benefits that we see is our nurses are able to explain the disease process and what to expect. So like you said, the families are a little more comfortable because they know, okay, this is normal, So how do you do it as a death doula?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that death doulas aren't healthcare professionals. We're not nurses. Some people have that background, just like I have a legal background. Some of them have been hospice nurses for many years or worked in the field. But really, a doula is a trained professional their role is not a healthcare provider. Their role is to serve as that companion and guide to families. But I think that my training has showed me what are some of those commonalities or trends. What happens when somebody has a heart condition versus certain types of cancer versus a progressive chronic condition like Parkinson's maybe, or Alzheimer's disease. So we do have that general knowledge, but I would say that experience helps with that too.
And some things are going to be universal as well. Like, across diseases, because just the way that, you know, you interact with your family, or just the common, you know, just humanism, I guess, right?
Mhm.
If that's even a word. But, you know,
If it isn't, it is now.
it is now. But yeah, no, okay. I totally understand. So we see a lot of fear in hospice. What about you in the death doula? Do you see people who are just afraid to even to broach the subject? How do you get over it?
Yeah, I think that fear of death is one of the primal fears that, you know, as humans, we all have at the root of us. So, yes, I think it's one of the biggest things to overcome as an industry of death care professionals, is that fear of, well, what is this doula going to be like, right? Does she dress in a black shroud and show up at the door and, make us cry and consider our mortality? As you can see, that's not really my jam.
You're not the Grim Reaper. Is that
Right.
okay? If that's the thought, then those people are wildly misinformed.
Right. I was expecting, like, you know, like Tuesday Adams or something, you know, but
Yeah, with the scythe coming walking in.
So I think that there is a lot of fear about it, and I think that there's a lot of the death doula industry or end of life doulas are really still fairly new in the end of life care models. So there's some uncertainty from both professionals and the public about what is it really and how or when would it be used. Um, so that's something that I think we're overcoming, but there is really a trend happening throughout the United States right now that um, people are looking at end of life. And I would say that one of the tipping points was Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal. You know, that was on the bestsellers list for a long time. It had mass readership and appeal. And people started saying, yeah, we're treating dying, you know, in this medical model that's been designed to keep us alive. Well, what happens when we can't be kept alive any longer? What are we doing to make sure that people are cared for as a whole and that their wishes are being fulfilled?
Two things there, Brenna. You say that book name and the author again, just so listeners know what it is.
Being Mortal by Atul Gawande.
Okay, I will challenge you to spell that, but we'll do that offline. And you make an interesting point. You know, I sit on an ethics board for a local hospice, and one of their medical director has said repeatedly that the medical community is trained to death is a failure. You know, your doctors are there to save lives, and it's difficult to separate yourself from success and failure when someone passes away, when someone dies, when they're quote on your watch. So I think that's a good point there. That's just a natural progression, and it has to be faced.
Yeah, and I think that we have to think about what that's doing to people who are dying too. When we put down that death is a failure, however, I haven't met any clients who haven't yet. You know, we are all mortal. So when we treat it like, you know, somebody's lost a battle or somebody's, you know, ended that war against life and death, you know, it's something that there is a lot of anguish and feeling, and often it's why hospice is brought in so late in the game, or palliative care models are looked at later in the process, because people are hoping that they can avoid it, you know, at any cost. And often palliative care, hospice, end-of-life doulas, as a team, we can best work together to make sure that their death is the way that honors how they want to live. Mm-hmm.
yeah, no, that's great, and it's so hard. And like Bryan had mentioned with the doctors, getting through to them with hospice, no one wants to do it because they feel like they're failing. They feel like, you know, oncologists, their job is to treat the person, try to, you know, treat the cancer and get them better. But it gets to a point where you can't do it. So even in like in your personal life, do you see, like, are you able to talk to your friends and let them know what you do? Are they comfortable with asking questions? I know from a hospice perspective, a lot of people that I know, they don't understand what it is. They think, you know, it's just, you know, getting people to sign on so they can die. And that's totally not what it is. But what do you see?
Yeah, so I'm the least fun person to invite to a party.
I can vouch for that.
Yeah, you tell them what you do and they walk away, right?
No, I think that people are fascinated because it's one of these taboos that they don't want to talk about. But once they get to know me, they're like, oh, wow, I had this experience, right? Where someone I love died, and I either thought it was a beautiful way to go or I hated it. It was awful experience. You know, people, um, we die alone, but our deaths have a ripple effect on our community, right? And so a death is something that impacts everyone in a circle. And I think that it is really important that we examine those to say, well, what about this was, even if it is hard and painful and something to grieve, what about that loss can we learn from? And so sometimes people at parties will approach me and say, oh, you do this. I had this experience with my loved one. And I think that those are really, I think that they're sacred and beautiful stories that we need to be able to share, because I think it's also part of healing is to be able to openly communicate about
Uh,
loss.
yeah, I 100% agree. Actually, I was talking to Bryan. I started doing this initiative, the hospice experience, trying to educate people on what it is and sharing their firsthand experiences. And I was really surprised to hear so many people who were willing to share their stories. You know, just people want to talk about it. It's just therapeutic for them to be able to just say what they went through and what happened, and just being a person to be able to listen to. You know, you know, it's really really great what you're doing.
Do you
Um,
find even more so now, over the last 2 or 3 months? I feel like people are just more eager to share stories, or maybe it's just I'm more open, I'm more receptive to just sitting and having those conversations. But I just feel like people are just everyone feels more open and less guarded and less, I don't want to say ashamed or embarrassed of anything, but just this happens, or I'm dealing with this, or this is an issue, whether it's mental health or something in their past. I'm hearing things I never thought I would hear from people, particularly the last 3 months.
I think from my end, I noticed that as well, and I didn't think of that. I thought my thought was maybe because people were just stuck at home, not having anyone else to talk to. You know, if I get on the phone with the family, they're going through everything, you know, and it's just an ear on the other side of the phone that's willing to listen to them for 40 minutes. So.
Yeah, it's something to do until it's bedtime.
Right, right. But that's a good point you bring up, Bryan. What about you, Brenna? What are you seeing? Are you seeing people that are more open?
Yeah, so like I said, I feel like this has been a slow burn. This is a movement that's happening. The movement's called death positivity, but people, I don't think that people as a culture are pro-death, or anti-death. But it's happening where people have started learning about it. There's a collective conscious, and the COVID pandemic has just like cracked us wide open. I think it's just brought all of this really close to home and exposed us to the fragility of life and how kind of all of these norms and structures that we've built up, they're not really always meaningful, right?
They can fall apart like that.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's really allowed people to dig deeper and really have communications with others that they would never have done before.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of COVID, so how has that impacted you? I know our nurses, they're telling me that they're having concerns because they're losing some of the personal touch. You know, everyone's in so much PPE. They're not allowed to do things with patients. They feel like it's very impersonal, like the end of life. Whereas before they were able to really care for the person hands-on, do a lot more. There's just like a lot of loose ends, that aren't taken care of. Are you seeing the same thing on your end?
I am. I think that COVID's really taught us that care is not just, treatment of ADLs, activities of daily living, helping someone with toileting or bathing. We are whole people, right? We need to make sure that people are cared for as their souls are cared for, their mental health is cared for. And, you know, the COVID pandemic has really impacted all of these others that were providing those services and care. Mental health professionals have moved out of facilities and to home, right? So they're doing Zoom and other ways to check in with patients. Social workers are often working out of their homes versus being boots on the ground in hospitals or clinics or facilities in general. Those activities directors that make sure people have rich lives that are, you know, something to look forward to. A lot of that has moved off-site and away from direct care. And I think that from an end-of-life perspective, in our area, a lot of the hospice volunteers were immediately taken out of inpatient hospice settings. And so that's been something that's really hard, because death doulas right now in most hospice inpatient settings are either serving as volunteers or privately contracted by families to come in. They are not medical professionals, so often we're deemed not, you know, an essential provider that can come in. And that has made it really hard. People are not getting what we would want for an end-of-life experience. I was just talking with one of my colleagues and friends who was, her father's in skilled nursing care, and they were FaceTiming with him as he was dying. They weren't able to be there and be with him. And I think that we can't underestimate the grief and trauma that's caused by not being able to be present for this momentous life event. So I think that my hope is that with increased testing, you know, more people will be able to come back into those care models, and that we also recognize how important this team approach is to care. We can't just work as silos if we want to best treat a whole person.
Right. Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
It's amazing. There's going to be so much lack of closure, you know, just because, like you said, people are watching their loved ones die over a screen instead of being able to be there with them. Is there anything that you've developed on your end, working with COVID patients or working with facilities that have been positive that you can use going forward? Something that's going to stick with you?
You know, I think that what I've learned from this again is the importance of having conversations about this early. And I think that COVID is something that's happening to all of us that can be icebreaker on the topic. Like, what would you want if this happened to you? And I think that it would be interesting to hear and sit and listen and have those conversations with your loved ones. I got a wave of clients who wanted to talk to me about what a ventilator does, right? And what it means. And I got a wave of people who wanted to update their directives to include some sort of COVID or pandemic clause, you know, and I think that what we have to do is say, okay, we need connection, and we need ways to touch people, even if we can't be, you know, physically in community together. So I've just been blown away by the use of platforms like this, so we can at least be close and have conversations. And I think that that's been a way to stay connected to families who are going through this, is that we can get on Zoom, we can get on whatever other platform there is, and just share with one another what's going on, and making time to do that. There is more time, you know, without kind of commuting from facility to facility to have those conversations too. So I can't state the importance of just having these impactful conversations.
On a little bit of a lighter note, since you're doing everything, working with families, working with patients on how to be remembered, right? So you're going through everything. Is there any particular person that stands out in your mind that was just something either really special or just really interesting, that the way that they wanted to be remembered?
Yeah, we do a lot of like legacy projects with clients, and so I talk to them a lot about what is something meaningful to them in their life. How have they connected with their loved ones and families? What do they want to remember, or their families to remember about them? And I think it's been really neat to see some people who have built like a collection, librarians who have built like a collection of books or quotes from literature that they've read, quilters who have kind of created their own death shroud from pieces of works that they've done over the years, or made things for their loved ones before they went. I've really heard from a lot of people and family members who can't thank us enough for kind of encouraging a letter to their loved ones, or certain family members that has meaning to them about what they want for their future, what they hope for, recipes, things that we share with one another and we want to be sure are included and thought of over the years.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. Well, thank you for doing so much, Brenna, and thank you for educating everyone, because I think it's amazing. Like you said, you need to start earlier. You can't just wait till this last minute. So you need to be able to educate people on what to expect. So thank you.
It really is fascinating. I remember we were at that flatbread breakfast joint in DC when you told me about this, and I was just like, I just couldn't get my head around it. And I could see you were so patient with me. And I was thinking, this is the perfect person, because if I was trying to explain this, I would have just said the same thing over and over, but louder and louder, expecting that you would understand it. And watching how patient you were explaining the whole process, because I could not comprehend it at first. You're probably the perfect person to be a death doula. It was great.